She risked everything to save him, then he revealed a secret that changed her life. A scream, swallowed by the blizzard, was all that separated him from oblivion. Aurora Abernathy, fighting the wind's icy claws, was about to stumble upon more than just firewood. She was about to unearth a secret that would shatter her simple world. The wind, a ravenous beast, howled through the mountain pass, each gust laced with the stinging bite of winter. Snowflakes, like shards of glass, whipped against Aurora Abernathy's face as she struggled forward, her worn boots sinking deep into the drifts. The sky, a bruised and angry purple, threatened a full-blown blizzard. She hugged her threadbare coat tighter, cursing the relentless cold that gnawed at her bones. Today, hunger had driven her further than usual, desperation pushing her to scavenge for firewood before night devoured the land. The forest at the mountain's base held its breath, an unsettling silence broken only by the tortured groan of wind wrestling with ancient pines. Aurora adjusted the axe biting into her shoulder, each exhale a fleeting cloud in the frigid air. Then, a sound, so faint it was almost a hallucination, a ragged, choked moan carried on the wind. Her heart slammed against her ribs. Had she imagined it? No, there it was again, a whimper of pain, raw and desperate. Her eyes darted around, trying to pierce the swirling white. The sound was close, yet the wind's furious roar made pinpointing its source impossible. "Hello," she called out, her voice trembling, fragile against the storm's fury. Silence. Aurora hesitated for only a heartbeat. Something primal, a deep-seated empathy, propelled her forward. Instinct screamed that someone, something, was in mortal danger. She moved cautiously, each step a crunching protest in the ice-crusted snow. Then, through the blinding white, she saw it, a dark, unnatural lump, barely distinguishable beneath a snowdrift. Her breath hitched. She surged forward, dropping to her knees beside the figure. Brushing away the snow, she gasped. It was a man. His face, gaunt and pale as death, was framed by dark hair, frozen stiff with ice. His clothes, though expensive, were ripped and soaked through. His lips were nearly black, his eyes fluttering weakly open. "Hey! Can you hear me?" Aurora shook his shoulder, her fingers quickly numbing. He barely reacted. "Sir! Wake up!" A pathetic groan escaped his lips, his fingers twitching feebly, fighting the encroaching paralysis of the cold. Aurora leaned closer, her voice urgent. "You need to wake up. If you stay out here, you'll die." His lips parted, and for a moment, she thought he would speak. Only a whisper, a breath of sound, escaped, "Help." Aurora's jaw clenched. Time was running out. She scanned him. His leg was twisted at a sickening angle, the snow beneath stained crimson. A broken leg. In this weather, he was doomed. Cursing under her breath, she grabbed his arm, trying to heave him upward. He was deadweight, heavier than he looked. "Come on," she gritted out, her muscles screaming. Shifting his arm over her shoulder, she staggered to her feet. Each step was an agonizing battle against the deep snow and the wind's relentless assault. The man groaned, a sound of pure agony, his head lolling against her shoulder. She didn't know who he was, or how he'd ended up here, but none of that mattered. He was a human being, and he was dying. All that mattered was getting him home before the cold stole his last breath. Aurora stumbled onward, her arms burning, her lungs aching. The man's breath was shallow, his body limp against hers. She couldn't fail. She wouldn't. By the time she reached her cabin, her legs were trembling, her vision blurring. She kicked the door open, nearly collapsing as she dragged him inside. The sudden warmth of the cabin was a shock, a comforting embrace after the icy wilderness. The fire in the hearth crackled merrily, casting dancing shadows on the rough-hewn wooden walls. With a Herculean effort, she maneuvered him onto the old, worn couch near the fireplace. His body was like ice, his fingers stiff with frostbite. Frantically, she grabbed a pile of blankets, wrapping them tightly around him before kneeling beside him to assess his injuries. His face was gaunt, his features sharp, even in unconsciousness. His expensive coat was ripped, the fabric crusted with frozen blood. Her eyes landed on his leg. A deep, ragged gash ran along his shin, the wound angry and raw against his pale skin. Aurora cursed, a harsh, whispered sound. Infection would be a death sentence. Working quickly, her hand steady despite the panic clawing at her, she cleaned the wound with warm water, wincing at the sight of the jagged cut. He stirred slightly, a faint groan escaping his lips, but he didn't wake. After wrapping his leg tightly with clean bandages, she let out a shaky breath. Now, all she could do was wait and pray. Hours crawled by. Aurora sat in the worn wooden chair, her gaze fixed on the man. His breathing had grown steadier, and his face was no longer the color of death. The firelight played across his features, highlighting the rough stubble on his jaw and the strong lines of his face. He didn't look like anyone she knew. Who was he? What cruel twist of fate had brought him to this remote corner of the world? Just as her mind swirled with unanswered questions, a hoarse voice shattered the silence. Where am I? Aurora shot to her feet, moving closer, her senses on high alert. The man's eyelids fluttered open, revealing stormy gray eyes that darted around the room, confusion clouding their depths. "You're in my cabin," she said, her voice firm but laced with concern. "I found you, half dead in the snow." He groaned, his hand moving to his temple as if trying to piece together broken shards of memory. I don't remember." Aurora narrowed her eyes, her instinct screaming caution. "What's your name?" He hesitated, blinking against the firelight, his brow furrowed in obvious pain. After a long, agonizing pause, he rasped, "Alistair. Alistair Blackwood." Something about the name, a faint echo of recognition, stirred within her, but she couldn't place it. "You were in bad shape when I found you," she said, crossing her arms, her gaze unwavering. "Your legs messed up, and you had nothing, no supplies, no proper gear. What happened to you?" Alistair exhaled sharply, struggling to sit up. Pain flashed across his face, and he clutched his bandaged leg. I don't know. I remember the cold, the storm." He shook his head, frustration darkening his features. "Everything else is a blur." Aurora studied him carefully. Was he lying? Or was he genuinely lost in the fog of hypothermia and trauma? Either way, something about this felt wrong, deeply unsettling. Then, his expression suddenly shifted from confusion to raw alarm. "My phone," he muttered, patting the pockets of his torn coat. "My wallet. Where the hell?" Aurora's stomach clenched. This was bad. "They weren't on you when I found you." Alistair's jaw tightened, his eyes hardening with a chilling realization. No, I had them. I remember. I had my phone, my wallet, my watch. They're gone." A heavy silence descended, thick with unspoken dread. Aurora had seen enough hardship in her life to understand the implications. Someone had taken his belongings. In a place as unforgiving as the Alaskan wilderness, that wasn't just a robbery, it was a death sentence. "You think someone robbed you?" she asked, keeping her voice even, carefully controlled. Alistair let out a bitter, mirthless laugh. "Seems like the only explanation, doesn't it?" Aurora frowned. If someone had left him out there to die, that meant whoever did this had wanted him gone. But why? She glanced at the flickering flames, the firelight dancing like uneasy thoughts. Alistair Blackwood, a man with expensive clothes, a sharp, calculating look in his eyes, and a complete memory loss, something about him didn't add up. And yet, despite the warning bells clanging in her head, she couldn't turn him away. Not yet. The morning light, filtered through frost-laced window panes, cast a pale, ethereal glow over the small wooden cabin. The fire in the hearth had burned low, leaving only glowing embers crackling softly in the stillness. Aurora moved about the cabin with quiet efficiency, layering more wood into the stove and setting a kettle over the flames. The air smelled of pine and the comforting, familiar scent of smoked meat, a humble, but vital, aroma in this house. Behind her, the sound of rustling blankets made her turn. Alistair was stirring, his movements slow and stiff, wincing as he adjusted his injured leg. His face still bore the pale exhaustion of someone recovering from a brush with death, but his sharp gray eyes flicked toward her, more alert, more present than the night before. "You're awake," she said, setting down the tin cup she had been holding. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, running a hand over his face as if trying to wipe away the lingering remnants of a nightmare. "Yeah, guess I owe you a thank you for not leaving me out there." Aurora scoffed, pouring hot water into the tin cup and walking over to him. "You'd be frozen solid if I had." She handed him the cup. "Drink. It'll help warm you up." Alistair took it hesitantly, eyeing the steaming liquid with suspicion. "What is this?" "Pine needle tea," she smirked at his doubtful expression. "You don't have much choice, city boy. It's either that or freeze." At the word city boy, Alistair gave her a bemused look but said nothing. He lifted the cup to his lips, grimacing slightly at the bitter taste, but he drank it nonetheless. Just then, the door creaked open, and an elderly woman stepped inside, wrapped in thick furs. Her sharp blue eyes immediately locked onto Alistair, assessing him with a calculating gaze. "So, this is the stranger you dragged in from the snow," she said, her voice lined with both curiosity and skepticism. Aurora straightened, her shoulders squaring defensively. "Grandma, this is Alistair." "Alistair, this is Aurora Abernathy." Alistair nodded, attempting to shift himself into a more upright position. Coraline merely hummed, stepping closer and taking a long, hard look at him before turning back to Aurora. "He shouldn't be here." Aurora crossed her arms, her voice firm. "I couldn't just leave him to die." Coraline sighed, untying her fur-lined hood. "You're too soft-hearted, child. Strangers mean trouble." Aurora clenched her jaw but said nothing. She knew Coraline wasn't cruel, just cautious. Life in the Alaskan wilderness had forged a steely pragmatism within her. Still, Aurora had made her choice. "He'll stay until he's strong enough to leave," she said firmly, her green eyes meeting her grandmother's steely blue ones. Coraline exhaled through her nose, clearly unconvinced, but she didn't argue further. Instead, she walked to the stove and began preparing breakfast, her movements slow but precise, years of experience etched into every gesture. Alistair watched in silence as the two women worked, his gaze drifting over the humble cabin. The walls were lined with shelves, stacked with jars of preserved food, buns, and leaves of dried herbs hanging from the rafters. A few old hunting rifles rested near the door, their wooden stocks worn smooth from years of use. Despite its simplicity, the cabin was warm, both in temperature and in the quiet, unspoken bond between grandmother and granddaughter. The smell of food filled the air, and Alistair's stomach twisted painfully in response. He hadn't realized just how hungry he was until now. Aurora caught the look on his face and smirked. "Haven't eaten in a while, have you?" "Not since." He frowned, trying to grasp the fading memories. "I don't remember." "Well, you're in luck. Breakfast is almost ready." A few minutes later, Coraline set down 3 wooden bowls on the table. Inside was a thick stew made from what looked like dried venison, root vegetables, and wild herbs. It was nothing fancy, just simple, rustic food, but it smelled incredibly good. Alistair hesitated before picking up the wooden spoon and taking a bite. The stew was hot, rich with deep, earthy flavors, and of slow-cooked meat and wild seasonings. It was unlike anything he had ever eaten before, not the refined meals of 5-star restaurants, nor the processed convenience food of city life. It was real, unpretentious, nourishing in a way that had nothing to do with wealth. He glanced at Aurora, who ate with the same quiet efficiency that seemed to apply to everything she did. "You live like this, every day?" he asked after a moment, his voice tinged with a mixture of curiosity and disbelief. Aurora looked up, her brow furrowed slightly. "Like what?" "Hunting for food, making your own medicine, chopping wood just to keep warm." She shrugged as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "Yeah. It's not easy, but it's life." Alistair shook his head, stirring his stew absent-mindedly. "I don't think I've never had to work that hard for anything." Coraline snorted a dry, humorless sound. "Doesn't surprise me." Alistair chuckled under his breath. "I bet." Aurora watched him for a moment, her expression unreadable. There was something strange, almost surreal, about seeing a man who came from immense wealth sitting at their modest table, eating their simple food. He was utterly out of place here. Yet, something about the way he was looking at his bowl, as if reevaluating everything he had ever known, made her wonder. Maybe he wasn't as lost as he seemed. The days passed slowly in the Abernathy cabin, each one marked by the rhythmic crackling of the fire and the muffled howls of the wind outside. Alistair's strength was gradually returning, though his injured leg still kept him from moving around too much. Despite the physical discomfort, he found himself strangely at ease in the quiet simplicity of the place. Aurora was always busy, chopping wood, checking traps, preparing food, and tending to her grandmother. She never once complained and never hesitated to get her hands dirty. Alistair had never met anyone like her before. One evening, as the fire flickered warmly in the hearth, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls, Alistair sat up on the couch, stretching his sore limbs. Aurora was at the small wooden table, carefully sewing the tear in her coat. The room smelled of pine and smoke, a scent he was beginning to associate with safety and unexpected peace. "I need to tell you something," he said, finally breaking the comfortable silence. Aurora didn't look up from her sewing. "You're not secretly a murderer, are you?" Alistair let out a small chuckle, the sound lighter than it had been in days. "No. But I am rich." That made her glance up, one eyebrow raised in a silent question. He exhaled, running a hand through his dark hair, the gesture laced with a hint of weariness. "My full name is Alistair Blackwood. I own a company called Blackwood Enterprises. We specialize in real estate and private investments. I have offices in New York, London, and Tokyo." Aurora blinked, her expression unchanging. "Okay." Alistair waited, his gaze fixed on her face, searching for some kind of reaction. Shock? Curiosity? Anything? But she just shrugged and went back to sewing. "That's it?" he asked, incredulous. She didn't even bother looking at him this time. "What do you want me to say?" "Well, I don't know," Alistair said, gesturing vaguely. Most people would be a little more surprised. Aurora tied off the thread and bit it between her teeth before finally meeting his gaze again. "It doesn't change anything." Alistair stared at her, genuinely baffled. "You're telling me you don't care? At all?" She sighed, leaning back in her chair. "Look, Alistair, maybe in your world, money means everything. But here, it won't light a fire. It won't feed you. And it sure as hell won't save you when you're half dead in a snowstorm." Alistair opened his mouth to protest, but she wasn't finished. "Out there," she said, gesturing vaguely toward the world beyond the cabin walls, "you might be some big-shot millionaire. But here, you're just a guy who got lost in the snow." The words hit him harder than he expected, a sharp sting of truth that cut through years of ingrained assumptions. His entire life, people had treated him differently because of his wealth, his employees, his so-called friends, even the women he dated. He was used to a world where money dictated power, where his name alone commanded respect. But Aurora didn't give a damn. For the first time in his life, Alistair felt something unfamiliar, something akin to humility. He leaned back against the couch, staring into the fire, his thoughts a tangled mess. Aurora, unfazed, stood and stretched, her movements fluid and graceful. "I'm going to bed. Try not to overthink it too much, city boy." Alistair watched her disappear into the small adjoining room, leaving him alone with his thoughts. For the first time, he wondered if maybe, just maybe, he had been living his entire life wrong. The morning air was crisp and biting, thick with the scent of pine and fresh snow. Alistair stepped out of the cabin, leaning against the wooden railing as he took in the endless expanse of wilderness before him. The towering mountains stood against the pale blue sky, their peaks dusted in white, untouched by time. It was a sight unlike anything he had ever seen in New York, a world that belonged not to men in suits, but to the earth itself. Aurora emerged from the side of the cabin, an old axe slung over her shoulder. She glanced at him, then at the firewood pile near the door. "If you're going to stand there all day, at least make yourself useful," she said, tossing him a pair of worn gloves. Alistair barely caught them before they hit his chest. "Chopping wood? Really?" Aurora smirked, her eyes sparkling with amusement. "Unless you'd rather freeze tonight." Alistair sighed, pulling on the gloves. He had spent his life making billion-dollar deals and managing entire companies. He had never chopped a single piece of firewood. But as he followed Aurora to the clearing behind the cabin, he realized something strange. For the first time, he wanted to try. At first, Alistair was terrible. The axe was heavier than he expected, and every time he swung it down, the logs barely split, bouncing harmlessly. Aurora watched, arms crossed, barely holding back a grin. "You don't have to hit it like it insulted your stock portfolio," she teased. Alistair groaned, wiping sweat from his brow. "Maybe you should just do it." "Nope," she said, stepping closer. "Here. Adjust your grip. Stand like this." She positioned his hands over the wooden handle, guiding him to shift his stance, her touch surprisingly firm. Her fingers were calloused, but warm, steadying his movements. Alistair found himself momentarily distracted by the nearness of her, the way the sunlight caught the strands of her wind-tossed hair. "Now, try again," she said, her voice a low murmur that sent a shiver down his spine. He swallowed hard and focused. This time, when he swung the axe, the log split cleanly in two. Aurora grinned, a flash of pure delight that lit up her entire face. There you go. Alistair stared at the broken pieces of wood, something akin to satisfaction stirring in his chest. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. Maybe there was something to this whole working with your hands thing after all. The days passed, and Alistair began to adapt. He helped Aurora with small tasks, fetching water from the frozen stream, patching up the old wooden roof of the cabin, and even setting simple snares in the forest. His suit and tie had been replaced with thick woolen clothes borrowed from Aurora's grandfather's old trunk. His hands, once used only for signing contracts, were now rough and calloused from labor. And for some reason, he didn't hate it. One evening, as they sat around the fire, Aurora handed him a bow. "You're going to teach me how to hunt now?" Alistair asked, raising an eyebrow. Aurora smirked. "You want to eat, don't you?" Alistair sighed, shaking his head. "Fine. But if I die doing this, you're telling my board of directors it was your fault." Aurora just laughed. The next morning, the two of them moved carefully through the woods, the air crisp with the scent of fresh pine. Alistair tried to step as lightly as Aurora, but she was like a ghost, silent and deliberate. He, on the other hand, snapped every twig in his path, announcing his presence to every creature within a mile. They tracked a rabbit for nearly an hour, and when the moment came, Aurora nudged him. "All right, city boy. Take your shot." Alistair hesitated, gripping the bowstring, his knuckles white. The rabbit twitched its ears, sensing danger. "You hesitate, you lose," Aurora whispered, her voice barely audible. Alistair exhaled slowly and released the arrow. It missed by a mile, soaring harmlessly over the rabbit's head. Aurora winced. "Okay, that was painful to watch." Alistair groaned, rubbing his forehead. "Maybe I should stick to real estate." She laughed. "Come on. We'll try again later." That afternoon, as they made their way back toward the cabin, something shifted in the air. The birds stopped chirping, the wind stilled, and an unsettling silence fell over the forest. Aurora froze her senses on high alert. Alistair frowned, his heart pounding in his chest. "What is it?" A deep, guttural growl rumbled through the trees, a sound that sent a jolt of primal fear through Alistair's veins. His blood turned to ice. Slowly, he turned his head. Just in time to see the massive grizzly bear emerge from the underbrush, its dark eyes locked onto them, its muscles tensing, ready to strike. It was close, too close, and it was huge, a mountain of muscle and fur. Alistair's breath caught in his throat. He had never felt fear like this before, a bone-deep terror that paralyzed him. Aurora reacted first. Slowly. "Move back," she whispered, her voice calm, but with an undercurrent of steel. Alistair did as she said, his heartbeat hammering in his chest, each beat a desperate drumbeat against the silence. The bear huffed, stepping forward, its massive paws crunching in the snow. Then, with terrifying speed, it charged. Alistair barely had time to react before Aurora grabbed his arm and shoved him behind a tree. In one fluid motion, she raised her rifle and fired a warning shot into the air. The deafening crack of the bullet shattered the silence, echoing through the trees. The bear skidded to a stop, its ears flattening against its head. It hesitated for a moment, its gaze flickering between Aurora and the distant sound of the gunshot. Then, with a final, frustrated huff, it turned and lumbered back into the woods, disappearing into the thick underbrush. Alistair's hands were shaking uncontrollably as he pressed himself against the tree, struggling to breathe, his lungs burning. Aurora lowered her gun, exhaling slowly, her expression grim. "That," Alistair panted, his voice barely a whisper, "was the single most terrifying thing I have ever experienced." Aurora smirked, slinging the rifle over her shoulder. "Welcome to Alaska." Alistair let out a breathless laugh, still trying to steady his nerves, his legs feeling like jelly. But something had changed, something profound had shifted within him. Aurora had risked her life for him, without hesitation, without thinking twice. And Alistair knew, deep down, that no one had ever done that for him before, not his business partners, not the women he had dated, not even the people he called friends. But Aurora, this girl who barely knew him, who had no reason to care, had saved his life. And in that moment, Alistair Blackwood, billionaire CEO, realized something fundamental. All the money in the world meant nothing compared to this, to the raw, visceral connection, to the selfless act of courage, to the realization that he was worth saving. The crackling fire was the only sound filling the cabin as Alistair sat at the wooden table, staring at his hands, turning them over and over as if seeing them for the first time. Outside, the wind howled against the walls, rattling the shutters, but he barely noticed. His mind was elsewhere, piecing together fragmented memories, trying to make sense of the fractured puzzle of his past. Aurora sat across from him, sipping her tea, watching him with quiet curiosity. "You look like a man who's just figured something out," she finally said, her voice soft, almost hesitant. Alistair exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples, trying to soothe the throbbing ache in his head. I know why I was out there. Why I nearly died." Aurora set her cup down, her gaze unwavering. "Go on." He let out a slow breath, trying to organize his thoughts, to put the pieces together into a coherent whole. "Before I woke up in the snow, I was in Alaska for a business meeting. My company, Blackwood Enterprises, was negotiating the deal to acquire a mining operation, a gold mine, to be exact." Aurora's brow furrowed, her eyes narrowing. "A gold mine?" Alistair nodded, his expression grim. "It's one of the last untouched reserves in the region, billions of dollars and untapped resources. My company had been negotiating the purchase for months." Aurora's expression darkened, a flicker of anger flashing in her green eyes. "And let me guess, the deal wasn't exactly clean?" Alistair hesitated, the guilt gnawing at him. The truth was, he hadn't given much thought to the moral implications of his business deals before Aurora. Before he had people for that. But now, sitting in this cabin, seeing the world through Aurora's eyes, things felt different, tainted with a moral ugliness he couldn't ignore. The negotiations were intense, he admitted, carefully choosing his words. "Not everyone wanted me to get control of the mine. There were other investors, competitors, people who stood to gain if I disappeared." Aurora leaned forward, her voice barely a whisper. "You think someone tried to get rid of you?" Alistair clenched his jaw, his hands forming into fists on the tabletop. "Not just someone. I think it was my assistant." The realization hit him like a physical blow, a gut-wrenching betrayal that left him gasping for air. Silas Reed. His right-hand man. The person who handled his schedule, his travel, and his security. The person he trusted most in his business, and the last person he had seen before waking up in the snow. The memory returned in sharp, vivid flashes, the private meeting in a luxury lodge near Fairbanks. Silas standing by the fireplace, reviewing the final documents. "Everything is set," Silas had said, his voice smooth, almost oily, as he poured Alistair a drink. "By this time tomorrow, the mine will be yours." Alistair had taken the glass, nodding, his mind already racing with the possibilities. "Good. I don't want any surprises." Silas had smiled, a chillingly false expression that Alistair now recognized for what it was, a mask of deception. "Of course. You can always trust me." Then, darkness. A sharp, searing pain in his skull. The bitter taste of something in his drink. And then, the cold. The blinding white of the snow. Alistair gritted his teeth, his jaw tightening until his muscles ached. He must have drugged me, left me out there, knowing I wouldn't survive. By the time they declared me missing, the deal would have already been signed, without me. Aurora's expression hardened, her eyes flashing with a righteous anger that mirrored his own. "So, he tried to kill you, for money." Alistair let out a bitter, mirthless laugh. "That's the world I come from, Aurora. A world where money is the only thing that matters." Aurora shook her head, disgust etched on her features. "Unbelievable. And to think, you trusted this guy." Alistair exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair, his jaw tightening. "Yeah. I did." He fell silent for a moment, staring into the fire, his thoughts a whirlwind of anger, betrayal, and a growing sense of purpose. "I can't let him get away with this." Aurora studied him for a long moment, her gaze intense, probing. "So, what are you going to do?" Alistair looked up, his gray eyes dark with determination. "I have to go back." A heavy silence fell between them, the only sound the crackling of the fire. Aurora leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms, her expression unreadable. "Right. Of course. Go back to your world of power and money. Alistair frowned, a flash of irritation crossing his face. I don't have a choice. If I don't stop him, he'll take everything I've built. He'll win. Aurora's lips pressed into a thin, disapproving line. And what happens after that? You fix your business, put the bad guy in jail, and go back to your fancy penthouse in New York? Alistair hesitated, his gaze flickering away from hers. He hadn't thought that far ahead. All he knew was that he couldn't let this betrayal stand, that he couldn't let Silas Reed get away with trying to murder him. But now, looking at Aurora, at the life he had come to respect in ways he never expected, a strange unease settled in his chest. Was that all there was? Was he destined to return to the gilded cage he had always inhabited? Aurora let out a slow breath, shaking her head, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and resignation. Look, Alistair, I get it. You have unfinished business. But just don't forget what you learned here. Alistair met her gaze, his heart aching with a sudden, overwhelming sense of loss. And for the first time, he realized he didn't want to leave. Not really. He reached across the table, his fingers brushing against hers, a silent plea for understanding. I will come back. Aurora looked at him, searching his face for any sign of deception, for any hint that he was just saying what she wanted to hear. Then, slowly, hesitantly, she nodded. Just once. You better. And for the first time in his life, Alistair Blackwood knew he had something worth coming back for. The day Alistair left, the sky was a dull gray, thick clouds rolling over the mountains like a heavy curtain. The air was colder than usual, biting at exposed skin, or maybe it only felt that way to Aurora, as she stood outside the cabin, watching him prepare to leave. He was dressed in borrowed winter gear, bundled against the elements, but something about him already looked different, more distant, as if he didn't quite belong here anymore. The transformation had already begun, the city reclaiming its own. His injured leg had healed enough for him to travel, though he still moved with a slight limp, a physical reminder of his brush with death. The sled dogs, restless and eager, barked in anticipation of the journey ahead. Aurora crossed her arms, keeping her expression neutral, trying to mask the turmoil raging inside her. You sure you're ready for this, city boy? Alistair smirked, though there was something undeniably sad in his eyes. I don't think I have a choice. She exhaled, her breath forming a small cloud in the freezing air. I guess not. Coraline, standing a few feet away, gave Alistair a hard, appraising look. Be careful out there, boy. The world ain't as forgiving as this place. Alistair nodded, his gaze earnest. I know. He turned back to Aurora, hesitating, a multitude of unspoken words hanging in the air between them. There were a million things he wanted to say, a million ways to express the gratitude and affection that filled his heart, but none of them felt right. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out something small, something precious, pressing it into her hand. It was a silver compass, worn with age, its surface scratched and tarnished with time. Aurora frowned, turning it over in her fingers, her eyes questioning. What's this? My grandfather's, Alistair said, his voice low, almost reverent. He used to say it would always point him home. Aurora looked up, meeting his gaze, her heart pounding in her chest. And where's home for you? Alistair hesitated, his expression unreadable. Then, softly, almost tentatively, he said, I don't know, yet. Aurora swallowed hard, curling her fingers tightly around the compass, clinging to its weight, its promise. You better figure it out. A long silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken emotions, with a yearning that transcended words. Then, finally, Alistair took a step back, his gaze lingering on her face for a moment longer before he climbed onto the sled. With a sharp command to the dogs, they lurched forward, their paws kicking up a flurry of snow. Aurora stood there, unmoving, watching as he disappeared into the white horizon, her heart aching with a mixture of hope and fear. And for the first time since she was a child, she felt something strange, something unexpected, something that scared her more than any blizzard or grizzly bear. She missed him. The weeks passed slowly, each day blending into the next in a monotonous cycle of work and worry. Aurora threw herself into her tasks, seeking solace in the familiar rhythm of physical labor. Hunting, chopping wood, fixing what needed fixing, she told herself she didn't care that Alistair hadn't sent word, that he had likely forgotten her, lost in the glittering distractions of his old life. But every morning, she found herself glancing toward the trail he had left on, her heart leaping with foolish hope. And every night, she found herself staring at the small silver compass, turning it over and over in her fingers as if it held some kind of secret answer, some reassurance that she wasn't a fool for believing in him. Coraline noticed, of course. Her grandmother missed nothing, her sharp eyes seeing through Aurora's carefully constructed facade. "He's not coming back," her grandmother said one evening, stirring a pot of stew over the fire, her voice matter-of-fact, devoid of pity. Aurora didn't look up, her shoulders stiffening. "I never said he was." Coraline sighed, shaking her head, her expression softening slightly. "You like him, Aurora." Aurora scoffed, her voice defensive. "Doesn't matter if I do. He has his world. I have mine." Coraline steadied her for a long moment, her blue eyes piercing. "And what if his world isn't what he wants anymore?" Aurora didn't have an answer for that. She remained silent, staring into the fire, the flames mirroring the conflicting emotions raging inside her. Then, one evening, everything changed. Aurora was outside, stacking firewood, her muscles aching, her mind numb from exhaustion, when she heard the distant sound of sled dogs approaching. Her heart leaped with a sudden, irrational hope, but she quickly tamped it down, reminding herself not to be foolish. She turned, expecting to see one of the village traders, bringing supplies or news from the outside world. But instead, a man she had never seen before stepped off the sled. He was tall, dressed in a heavy coat lined with fur, his face sharp and unfamiliar, bearing the unmistakable air of someone who didn't belong in these parts. The man pulled something from his pocket, a sealed envelope, its crisp white surface stark against the rough landscape. "Miss Abernathy?" he asked, his voice formal, almost impersonal. Aurora nodded slowly, her breath catching in her throat. The man extended the letter, his gloved hand outstretched. "This is from Alistair Blackwood." Her heart slammed against her ribs, a wave of exhilaration washing over her. She hesitated for only a moment before taking the envelope, her fingers trembling slightly. The cold paper felt stiff and unfamiliar in her hands. The man gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, his eyes devoid of emotion. "He's waiting for you." Aurora's breath caught, her mind reeling. Alistair hadn't forgotten her. He was still out there, still thinking of her. And now, for the first time, it was her turn to decide whether she was brave enough to step outside her comfort zone, to embrace the unknown, to risk everything for a love that defied all logic. It was her turn to decide where she belonged. Aurora had never seen so many lights in her life. New York City stretched out before her, a glittering tapestry of human ambition and relentless energy, like a living, breathing entity, its towering skyscrapers reaching toward the heavens, its endless streams of people moving like currents through the streets. The cacophony of honking horns, the flashing billboards, and the sheer, overwhelming scale of the place were both exhilarating and terrifying. She tightened her grip on the small silver compass in her pocket. Her only tether to the world she had left behind, her only reminder of who she truly was. The black car that had picked her up from the airport snaked through the bustling streets, its tinted windows offering a detached, almost surreal view of the city's frenetic energy. Until it pulled up in front of a grand hotel, its entrance lined with uniformed doormen and gleaming chrome. The doorman, with a practiced smile and a polite nod, opened her door, offering her a gloved hand. But Aurora barely noticed him. She was too busy staring up at the massive glass structure towering above her, its sleek, modern facade reflecting the city lights like 1,000 shimmering stars. Was this really where Alistair lived? Could she ever truly belong in a place like this? The elevator ride to the penthouse was silent, save for the quiet hum of the machinery and the distant rumble of the city below. Each floor she ascended felt like a step further away from the familiar comforts of her Alaskan home, a step deeper into a world she didn't understand. And then, the doors slid open, revealing a scene that took her breath away. Alistair was waiting. He stood just inside the entrance to the penthouse, his silhouette framed by the soft, ambient lighting. For a moment, neither of them spoke, their eyes locked in a silent exchange that bridged the distance between them. He looked different, sharper, more polished than she remembered. Dressed in a tailored suit, his face clean-shaven, his hair neatly styled, he was every bit the successful billionaire he had been before. But his eyes were different. There was something softer there, something more vulnerable, a warmth that she hadn't seen in him when they first met. As if the ice surrounding his heart had finally begun to melt. "Aurora," he said, his voice a low, resonant rumble that sent a shiver down her spine. He stepped forward, closing the distance between them. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to stay steady, to meet his gaze without flinching. The sheer opulence of the penthouse was overwhelming. Polished marble floors reflected the city lights, creating an illusion of endless space. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the cityscape, a breathtaking spectacle of human achievement. The air hummed with a quiet, almost unnatural perfection. The sheer wealth of it all was a stark contrast to the rustic simplicity of her cabin, a world away from the rugged beauty of the Alaskan wilderness. It felt like stepping onto another planet, a world she didn't understand, a world she wasn't sure she could ever truly inhabit. Alistair must have sensed her hesitation, her unease, because he stopped a few feet away, his expression softening, his eyes filled with genuine concern. "I know it's a lot," he admitted, his voice gentle. "But I didn't bring you here to impress you." Aurora crossed her arms, her gaze unwavering, her voice laced with a hint of skepticism. "Then why did you bring me here, Alistair?" Alistair took a slow, deliberate breath, his gaze locking with hers. The air crackled with unspoken tension. "Because I needed you to see," he said, his voice raw with honesty, "the man I used to be, and the man I'm trying to become." Over the next few days, Aurora saw firsthand just how much Alistair had changed. He had fired Silas Reed, pressing charges against him for attempted murder and fraud. He had reclaimed control of his company, dismantling the corrupt practices that had flourished under his blind trust. But more than that, he had started something new, something that came from the heart, not from the bottom line. He had established a foundation, the Abernathy Initiative, a non-profit organization dedicated to helping people in rural communities, especially in places like Alaska. "It's a non-profit," Alistair explained one evening over dinner, his voice filled with passion, dedicated to providing infrastructure, medical aid, and educational resources to underserved communities. Real, lasting change. Aurora blinked, her heart swelling with a mixture of pride and disbelief. "You named it after me?" Alistair smiled, a genuine, heartfelt expression that transformed his entire face. "I wouldn't be here without you, Aurora. You saved my life in more ways than one." She stared at him, searching his face for any sign that this was just another business strategy, another calculated move to impress her. But all she saw was sincerity, a genuine desire to make a difference, and a profound sense of remorse for the mistakes of his past. One night, as they walked along the edge of Central Park, the city lights twinkling around them, Alistair finally said what she had been waiting to hear, the words she had longed for, the words that held the key to her heart. "I love you, Aurora." Her breath caught in her throat, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. The city seemed to fade away, the noise and the lights dissolving into a distant hum. All that mattered was Alistair, his eyes locked with hers, his voice filled with raw, undeniable truth. Alistair reached for her hands, his grip warm and steady despite the chill in the air. "I don't care about anything else, Aurora. Not the money, not the company, not the power. I just want you. I want to build a life with you, a life that matters." Aurora's heart soared, but she didn't speak right away. Because part of her still hesitated, part of her still didn't trust this world, didn't trust the promises of a man who had once been so deeply entrenched in its corrupting influence. She had seen men of power before, men who made promises but never truly understood what life was like outside their bubble of privilege. And she wasn't willing to be another trophy, another piece in someone else's collection. So instead of professing her love, instead of surrendering to the intoxicating allure of his words, she issued a challenge, a test of his true commitment. She lifted her chin, meeting his gaze, her voice firm, unwavering. "If you love me, Alistair, then prove it." His brows furrowed, his expression confused. "How, Aurora? What do you want me to do?" Aurora held up the silver compass, its worn surface reflecting the moonlight. "Find your way home." The next morning, Aurora returned to Alaska, unsure if Alistair would follow, unsure if she had made the right decision. She needed time to sort through her feelings, time to determine if Alistair's transformation was genuine or just a temporary facade. She needed to know if he was truly willing to leave his old life behind, to embrace the values she held dear, to find his path in the wilderness. But he did follow. He didn't charter a private jet, didn't arrive in a tailored suit, didn't try to impress her with his wealth or his power. He came as a man who wanted to learn, a man who was willing to humble himself before the challenges of the Alaskan wilderness. He spent months in the village, working alongside her, living among the people, learning their ways, and understanding the land, the people, and the struggles they faced every day. He chopped wood, carried water, helped mend fences, and even learned how to hunt, though he was still terrible at it, his city slicker instincts constantly betraying him. And in that time, Aurora saw the truth. She saw that this wasn't just a game to him, that this wasn't just a fleeting attempt to win her over. He had truly changed. He had shed the skin of his former life, embracing a new identity, a new purpose. He had found a connection to the land, a respect for the people, and a genuine desire to make a positive impact on the world. One evening, as they stood by the river, watching the northern lights dance across the sky, painting the heavens with vibrant hues of green and purple, Alistair turned to her, his eyes filled with a quiet intensity, his voice steady and true. "Aurora," he said, his heart laid bare before her, "can I stay?" She looked at him, at the man who had once been lost in a storm, who had been broken and betrayed, who had rebuilt himself not with money, but with something far greater, with humility, with compassion, with a newfound sense of purpose. At the man who had finally found his way home, not to a glittering penthouse in the city, but to a simple cabin in the wilderness, to a life filled with love and meaning. She smiled, her heart overflowing with a joy she had never thought possible. Slipping her hand into his, her fingers intertwining with his, she whispered, "Yeah, Alistair. You can stay." And as the lights shimmered above them, bathing the world in an ethereal glow, Aurora knew that this was just the beginning. That their journey together was just beginning. And so, Alistair found something far more valuable than wealth, something far more lasting than power. He found purpose, he found love, and he found a place to truly call home. Aurora, the girl who had once saved a stranger in the snow, had unknowingly saved a lost soul, a man searching for something he never knew he needed. Together, they built a life that bridged two worlds, a life that honored the beauty of both the untamed wilderness and the soaring ambition of the city. But in the end, it wasn't the wealth or the power that mattered. It was the simple moments, the quiet love, and the profound understanding that true riches come not from what we own, but from the people who stand beside us, from the connections that bind us together, from the love that lights our way home. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more heartfelt stories that inspire and uplift. Let us bring you more stories of love, resilience, and the unexpected beauty of human connection. Until next time, stay warm, stay hopeful, and always believe in the kindness of strangers.